What's going on, everyone? My name is Jason Vincent, and today we are going to be talking about how I have my Sony a9III set up to shoot weddings. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be going through. I'm going to be walking through how I have this camera set up to shoot weddings, primarily documentary and some portrait style work. So a lot of the stuff that I do is very fast paced. And so I have my camera set up in a way specifically so that I can work very quickly between capturing moments and portraits, working with natural light and off-camera flash. I have 3 different ways that I use autofocus, all very quickly and seamlessly, so I don't have to dive into menus and stuff like that. So stick around for that. I also have a special way that I'm using the ability to adjust the flash timing settings, so you don't have to dive into the menu and do all kinds of crazy things when you're working with that as well. Okay, so really quick, what we're gonna do is we're going to dive into the menu, but the very first thing that I do when I get a camera is I have some very basic overall settings that I set up. So we're gonna go ahead and do that, and then we'll dive into some of the nitty-gritty stuff with custom buttons and things like that. So as soon as I get a camera, the very first thing that I do is I jump into the camera setting here and I make sure that I set up my image quality things. And so obviously I'm shooting RAW. I don't do RAW plus JPEG or anything like that, but when I'm shooting RAW, I make sure to shoot on compressed RAW. And then down here in the record media settings, I make sure that I shoot simultaneously to both cards. That way, if there's ever a card issue or something happens during the transfer of one, I always have a backup of the other. And basically one of those cards is just always in the camera, and I just format after every session or after every wedding. Okay, now from here, the next thing that I do is I set up my basic shooting function, which is gonna be aperture priority. Now I don't use A on the dial, I actually use 1, and I'll explain a little bit why here in a second. But in order to get this set up, I do initially set the camera to A. And then once it's set to A, this is aperture priority, obviously. And then what I do is I come in here and I make sure to set up my ISO. And so I come over to ISO and I set the ISO to auto ISO. And then I jump into the settings here and I make sure that I want to set my my minimum shutter speed on ISO to 1/250th of a second. Now I find that when I'm documenting natural light moments, which is when I use this setting, 1/250th of a second is kind of around where I want to be for just general use. That's fast enough where I can freeze motion, but it's not so fast that my ISO has to ramp up super quickly. Now there are situations where I will dial this shutter speed up if I'm trying to document something that's a little bit more fast paced, or I'll dial it way down if it's something that I really want to try to bring in as much light and there's not a lot of movement, which I have a custom button set up for that. So we'll get to that here in a second. Okay, now once I have my aperture priority set up, the next thing I'm gonna do is set up my focus mode. And so my general focus mode is going to be the tracking flexible spot XS, which is the smallest little tracking square, okay? So once I have that set up, I'm going to actually now save this setting to the 1 function on the dial. And so I'm gonna go menu, I'm gonna come over here to the red little camera, and then I'm gonna go to here, and I'm going to go to camera set memory, and then I set that to 1, okay? Now, once I have that set up, before I change anything else, I'm going to go into my menu setting. I just hit the FN, and I'm gonna go over here to subject recognition, and I'm gonna turn this off. And now that it's off, I'm gonna go menu, and I'm gonna come over to this shoot menu, and I'm going to say set camera memory, and now I'm gonna go over and I'm gonna set it to 2. Now, the reason for this is that a lot of the times when I'm generally shooting, when I'm on, say, this camera set memory 1, what I'm doing is I'm using the tracking and it's gonna automatically lock onto an eye no matter what, if there's some sort of face within the little area that I'm trying to focus. Now, where this becomes an issue is if I'm trying to focus on maybe like a bride's earring or on her lips or things like that, where I want to focus on something that's near an eye and I don't want the focus point to jump to an eye. And so in those situations, I'll just flip now the dial to 2, and that automatically keeps all of my settings what they normally are for general shooting, but instead of tracking and jumping to an eye, it's going to only track on what I set that focus point to. Now, I don't use this for general shooting because in general, I do want the focus point to snap to an eye, okay? So this gives me both options very quickly, just quick turn of a die. Okay, now from here, real quick, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to M for manual, and I'm going to make sure that I set my, my face tracking is gonna be back to on, and then I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna set my ISO back to its base ISO, which is going to be 250. And so now what this does is now every time I go to M, it's going to be at these base settings. And then if I go back to 1, I'm back to aperture priority. So this makes it really easy so I can jump back and forth between aperture priority and manual, and I'll have to also dive in to change my ISO back and forth. Okay, now from here, let's go ahead and jump into setting up the custom buttons. Okay, so setting up the custom buttons, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come down here into the toolbox area. I'm going to do dial customization. I'm gonna go to custom key set. And now these are gonna be where all of my buttons are. So I'm just gonna start at the top and kind of work my way down. So the very first button that I have is going to be this AEL button, and I have it set to recall custom hold 1. Now this button is kind of a tricky one, so I call this my oh crap button. So the way this is set is so I hit recall, so it's gonna be under shoot mode, and it's gonna be recall custom hold 1. And as you set that, it's gonna give you all of these little check boxes, and you can go in and you can change all of these settings. And so what I have shoot mode set to aperture priority. I have the aperture set to f1. Basically, this is just the lowest option possible. So no matter what lens I throw on it, it's automatically going to default to the lowest aperture. Unless it has an aperture ring, then it's going to default to whatever that ring is set to. The drive mode is going to be continuous shooting. And then everything else is off until I get to ISO. ISO is going to be set to ISO auto. The metering mode is multi. The focus mode is going to be continuous. The focus area is going to be tracking. And if I click into here, it's going to be tracking. Feel free to play around with this. Sometimes I'll actually set it to this one. And then nothing else is off. And then I have AF on set to on. Okay. So after that's done, you're gonna come down here and you're gonna click on register. And so what this button does is if for some reason I am in manual, say I'm shooting an off-camera flash for some sort of moments and I'm trying to really drag down all of the ambient light, and then all of a sudden a moment starts to happen that I really quickly want to grab. Instead of having to like take my hand off of shooting and come up and turn the dial and then come back down, so I can move really quickly, all I have to do is press and hold the AEL button and it'll automatically lock focus as well as revert to aperture priority. So it just overrides all of the settings to what I have that custom hold set to. As long as I'm holding the button, it's gonna be aperture priority with the lowest aperture set, and it's gonna engage autofocus. And then as soon as I let it go, it's gonna revert back to the manual settings that I was shooting previously. So this just makes it really quickly. If I'm shooting anything, I just press and hold that button, grab a moment, let it go, get back to what I was doing without having to dive back and forth and change dials and things like that. Okay, now from here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back in here and we're gonna walk through. So the next one that I have is obviously just the AF on is gonna be AF on. And then recall custom hold 2 is going to be my movie record button because I don't do really any sort of video, so I don't really need it to be record on. And so if you click on that, recall custom hold 2, and everything is gonna be turned off until you get down here. I have focus mode set to continuous AF, and then I have the focus area set to spot extra small, but not the tracking version. Okay, so this is just a standard focus extra small square. So it matches the square that I have on my other mode, but instead of tracking, it's just spot. And then you come all the way down and I have AF set to on, and then you hit register. And so what this does is if I am focusing on, say, this little chest piece, it's going to be tracking that chest piece as I hold AF on. Now, the other mode, the record button, now, if I have the focus on here and I'm holding it, if I move off of the piece, it's automatically going to focus on whatever the point is set to. So it's not going to track. So if I'm focusing on two different people and I want to just move the frame back and forth without having to worry about tracking or removing focus, refocus, remove focus, focus, I can just hold this button and it'll lock focus. And as I move the focus point to anything else, it's just going to automatically focus on whatever the point is on without sort of any tracking feature engaged. It's not something that I need to use a lot, but it's nice to have when I need it without having to dive into the menu and change things around. And I don't shoot any sort of video, but when I do, I'll just switch the dial to movie mode. And in that situation, it just replaces that record button. It's no longer a focus mode. It'll still start recording video. Okay, so now diving back into the settings, we are going to go down. So the next setting that I have is going to be this C3 button up here on the top left. And I have this set to flash timing. What this does is it makes it really easy to quickly turn my flash timing settings on and off for when I'm using off-camera flash in higher sync speeds. Or I can turn it off if I'm gonna be in a lower sync speed and not wanting to have to mess with the timing settings and things like that. Now, if you are unfamiliar with this flash timing setting and its importance and how it works, I have another video where I walk through all of the the nitty-gritty of the difference between things like traditional sync, high-speed sync, and now this global shutter sync, and why this flash timing feature is so important. So if you want, I'll maybe leave a link around on the edges here, or I'll just drop it down in the comments, whatever one's easier for me to set up. But yeah, and then the next thing I have is going to be the button down here at the bottom, the C4 trash can. I have this set to touch operation select, so I can just turn the touchscreen on and off with that button. Moving on, I have the press of the little joystick here set to focus standard, and what this does is anytime I press it, it just resets the focus point back to the center. So I can quickly, if I have it like down in the bottom left and I want to go back up to the right or even back to the center, instead of having to push that joystick a whole bunch of times to get it where I want it to go, I can just press it, goes to the center, and then I can quickly, easily move it back to where I want it. And then everything on this dial I have set to not set. Normally it's things like ISO and stuff like that, but I find that I bump this dial a lot. And so I just set it to not set because every time I put something on there, I'm constantly hitting it. So the only thing I would actually set to one of these is maybe something that I have to like press and hold. But I haven't really found anything that I want to put there. And so I just have them all set to not set. If you find yourself not bumping into this dial, totally use them. Okay, the next thing I have is the C1. On the top next to the shutter, I have set to pre-capture. So if I find myself setting up and waiting for a moment to happen, I'll just press that button, knowing that I can quickly take the photo when a moment's happening, and I'll get pictures before I actually hit the shutter button, as long as I'm engaging autofocus. And I have that set up to capture at 120 frames per second. And I only have it set up to capture about a quarter a second. And the next button I have is going to be the C2 button, and I have this set to ISO auto minimum shutter speed. So what this allows me to do is really quickly adjust that minimum shutter speed from 1/250th of a second to maybe 1/500th or 1/1000th, or I'll also go as low as like 1/4 of a second a lot of the times. If I'm shooting something that is in a lower light situation that I don't necessarily need to worry about movement happening. Because of the in-body image stabilization, I feel pretty comfortable getting a sharp image at up to about 1/4 of a second. Okay. Moving on, I have the front button, the new one that's up here at the front. I have that set to default, which is going to be the continuous shooting speed burst. So if I'm shooting in like a medium or low frame rate, if I press and hold that, it automatically defaults quickly to the 120 frames per second. And then moving on, I have the button on the lens set to not set. Again, it's one of those things that I bump sometimes, and not all of my lenses have it. And so I just prefer not to get used to using it for situations where I'm using a lens that doesn't actually have it. And then the last one is going to be kind of a tricky one, because this is going to be changing one of my wheels, but only for when I'm in manual. So what you'll want to do is here on this setting, there's this little checkbox that says separate M mode from other modes. And you have to check that box. And once you check that box, you're able to set these wheels up as different settings depending on if you're in manual or not in manual. So when I'm in aperture priority, I want this wheel to be exposure compensation, because this is the wheel that I'm using to make my image darker or brighter, based off of whatever the auto settings that the camera is deciding on. But when I'm in manual, I'm using my aperture, shutter speed, ISO to default to those. So I don't need exposure compensation because I'm adjusting all of those settings manually. But what I do need is I need a quick way to adjust my flash timing. And so down here at the bottom in manual mode, I have this exposure compensation wheel set to the flash adjust timing settings. And so if I'm in manual mode and I press my C3 and I have my my flash timing setting to on, if I adjust this wheel, it automatically adjusts my timing setting. So I don't have to dive into the menu and adjust this timing setting, because it's one of those things that you kind of have to play around with as you're getting things set up. It's not really intuitive to set your flash timing. So you have to like take a picture, adjust your flash timing, take a picture, adjust your flash timing until you get it set right. It is a lot of work to have to dive into the menu every time you want to make one of those changes. And so this just makes it really easy where I can adjust my flash timing, take a picture, look at it, adjust my flash timing, take a picture, and I don't have to dive in the menu to do that anymore. Okay, so one more setting that I do like to change is I also changed how the display button works. I do find it useful to have the ability to turn off all of this display features, but I don't like having to like cycle through a bunch of different things like the level and like some display, all display, no display. And so what I do is I come in here into the little toolbox and I come to display screen set, and I go to monitor, and I have display all info checked, and then I have no display info, and then I have the exposure time out. And so what this does is I'm either seeing everything or I'm seeing nothing, and it also will show the exposure settings, but after you do some adjustments, that will also disappear. So I don't want to see it all the time. And so in this situation, when I have the display info off and I'm done setting up my settings, everything will be gone and all I'll see is the image, so I can concentrate on just the images and not be distracted by a ton of different settings and stuff taking up more screen real estate, okay? And then I also have the same thing set up for the Finder. I have display all info and then display no info. Okay, so one last thing that I want to point out is that I also have a little My menu set up, which is going to be under the star, My menu, and I just have one. The things that I have here is going to be format, anti-flicker. So if I'm in a situation where the lights are flickering, I can turn that on. I also have AF with shutter set up. I do use back button focus if you couldn't already tell, but there are situations where I want to hand my camera to someone else to take a photo, and I don't want to have to explain how to turn on autofocus with the press of a button, and then you have to hold it and all the different things because everyone's used to just the half press of the shutter. So I just make it really easy on myself to be able to turn that on and off. I also have started to use some manual focus lenses, and so I have the peaking display set up so I can quickly turn that on and off, as well as being able to set up the focal length so that I can set the focal length so that the in-body image stabilization is optimized to whatever lens I have currently attached to the camera, if for some reason it's one of the manual focus lenses that doesn't transfer that data to the camera. So from here, everything else in the camera is basically just set to default, aside from some movie recording features like shooting 4K 60 and all of that different stuff and codecs. I don't really know enough about that to feel like I can teach you about it, so feel free to watch any other videos that you find on YouTube for how to set up this camera for shooting video. But from there, this is how I have the camera set up for shooting stills. It works really well for me. Obviously, if you are a hybrid shooter and you need that movie record button, feel free to keep that as movie record and work off of these. But hopefully you found something in here useful. If you did, I'd love all the, like, subscribe, comment, all of that fun stuff. And from here, catch you on the next one.